way to frame any of this. I'm not sure. It's definitely dramatic, but like, there's just a degree of melodrama in like an interaction between students.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. My name is Maria Spart. I'm the National Director of DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. We are the largest socialist organization in the United States, although we're not a political party. And we actually have a youth section that has a campaign around student debt, but our adult organization also considers it an important issue because so many young people my age who are years out of school, are still drowning in debt. So it's really an issue that allows us to reach a lot of people and talk about what's wrong with our current economic system. So we decided to partner with Dissent on this event tonight, and we're actually going to be continuing to work on this issue going forward. So do you want to get in here or have Sarah come up?
Yeah, Chris, were you going to talk about the discussion group?
Sure.
Okay.
My name is Chris Mazzano. I'm a member of the New York City Local of Democratic Socialists of America. We are going forward working with Dissent on having an ongoing reading and discussion group on the question of the crisis in public higher education in the United States and the politics of student debt. Our first meeting is going to be in a couple of weeks on November 8th. It's going to be in Brooklyn. There's a flyer in the back on that little table with a red tablecloth with all the details, including the readings and such. So anyone who's interested, please come. And if you have any questions, we have contact information on the flyer.
Jackie has one more announcement, and then we'll get started.
So my name is Jackie Sewell, and I'm the national organizer for the youth section of Democratic Socialists of America. And after this, we're going to have a reception where we're featuring the Danish Social Democratic Youth that have delegates at this event. Alexander, do you want to raise your hand? This is Alexander. He's been in contact with me to get people out. And so we'll be able to talk afterwards about higher education in Denmark, how it works there, and also they've been here observing the elections, so we can also get their perspective on our two-party system.
All right, great. Thanks everyone for coming out. My name is Nick Serpy. I'm the online editor at Dissent Magazine, and I'll be the moderator tonight. I'm also the co-editor, along with Sarah Leonard, who's in the back, of a section in our latest print magazine here, the fall issue, that's on higher education. And that's kind of what prompted us to get involved with this discussion tonight. So this was billed as a debate about student debt, how it got so bad, how it works now, what to do about it. But I think that a lot of the presentations from our panelists are going to complement one another as well. So I think that I will start by introducing our panelists. First to speak tonight is going to be Tamara Draut, who is the Vice President of Policy and Research at Demos, which is a New York City-based think tank that's committed to a more equitable and democratic society. She's also the author of Strapped, Why America's 20 and 30-somethings Can't Get Ahead, and a recent report on student debt and social mobility. Next will be Sarah Jaffe at the end of the table. Sarah is an independent journalist. Her work's been published in The Nation, The American Prospect, also in Dissent. She has an article coming in our winter issue that's going to be on feminism and labor. She is also the former labor editor at Alternate. And there she wrote about debt collectors, student loan servicers, and a lot about student politics as well. And then finally we have Andrew Ross. He's a professor of social and cultural analysis at NYU, and his books include Nice Work If You Can Get It, Life and Labor in Precarious Times, The University Against Itself, The NYU Strike and the Future of the Academic Workplace, and most recently, Bird on Fire, Lessons from the World's Least Sustainable Cities, which is about Phoenix. And he's also a member of the Occupy Wall Street Strike Debt Assembly, which put out this wonderful pamphlet, this Debt Resistors Operations Manual. I don't know how many copies Andrew has with him, but it's also available as a PDF online. So, with no further ado, each panelist is going to give a little bit of a presentation, and afterwards they're going to have a discussion amongst themselves, and then we'll take questions from you. Thank you.
Great. Well, hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yes, I'm projecting. Good. Thank you for coming out tonight for one of my favorite things to talk about. which is student debt. So I think my role is to talk a little bit about how we got to $1 trillion in student debt, and I want to wrap up by saying what I think we need to do to make sure we don't get to $2 trillion in student debt in the next decade. So I want to start by saying something that may not be obvious to everybody, which is the debt for diploma system, which you all went through, I went through, is a pretty radical shift from the way we used to support access to higher education. So about a generation ago, and this system held until maybe mid to late 80s, it used to be that a middle-class family could pretty much afford the price of a public college or university. And their son or daughter could make up the difference with a little bit of work throughout the year. And then working class and lower income households could afford college largely with the Pell Grant, and also some work. And taking out loans was the exception. It was certainly not the rule it was today. So we had low college tuition and federal grant aid that really helped meet the needs of lower income students. Now, that system has been sort of chipped at and attacked and denigrated for a generation, which is part of the story of why we got to $1 trillion. So what has happened since 1980 and today? A couple things that have really made college much less affordable and led to the big run-up in debt. One is that family income has stagnated. Incomes in the lower bracket of households have declined. So households have less money available to help save or pay for college tuition. But the biggest driver of the rise in tuition, and which has tripled after you adjust for inflation, tripled since 1980. So in one generation, the cost of a 4-year public university has tripled. Cost of a community college, and these are averages, has doubled since then. The main reason why is that public funding has declined over time. It hasn't kept up with enrollments. It has not grown to accommodate all the students that now want to go to school, need to go to school. So let me give you just a couple numbers that really put this in perspective. So state funding, and that's where most public, the CUNY system, the community college systems get their operating revenue, which is through the state and some local appropriations. So it's down from about $8,000 per full-time equivalent student to just around $6,300. But the way, and this is all in a report Demos did, but I like to look at funding per $1,000 of personal income. So it used to be that we had state funding of higher ed at $8.75 per $1,000 of personal income. It's now just over $6 per 1,000. Now, why is it important to look at it as a percentage of personal income available in a state? Because that tells you what the resources are available to state. And the reality is funding per $1,000 has declined at the same time that personal income overall has grown by 2/3. So it's not that we don't have the money to put towards higher ed. It's that the money is being captured and largely funneled toward other priorities. Things like corporate tax breaks, things like prisons, things like growing healthcare costs. It's important to keep that in mind because you will often hear, we're broke. We're not broke. We're just using money in different ways than we used to. And that, in turn, is part of the bigger story here, which is really the rise of the idea of the denigration of anything that is a public good, anything that government does, anything that benefits the common good, and a shift of making that a private responsibility. Higher ed used to be something all of us helped pay for. It was a socialized cost. Today, it is largely borne by individuals, and increasingly so through student loan debt. So that's the big sort of picture. The other thing that has happened is that as tuitions have risen, the federal aid program, particularly Pell Grants, hasn't been able to keep up. So the purchasing power, back in 1980, a Pell Grant covered $7 out of every $10 of costs at a college. Today it covers just over $3 of every $10 that it costs to go to school. Two reasons for that. One, tuitions have skyrocketed. Two, there's a lot more students enrolled than there used to be. So what aid is available, even though we have increased spending on the Pell Grant significantly, even though the maximums have raised over time, it's not enough to keep up with tuition or how many students there are. So what aid is available is spread a lot more thinly across a lot more students. So how do we stop this? I think there are some short-term options that are good. Reforming the bankruptcy code is a big one. Right now, the big banks got a nice exception in the bankruptcy reform law that makes private loans pretty much the only type of consumer debt that cannot be wiped out through bankruptcy. At the same time, I also think we need to actually reform the bankruptcy code to actually make federal student loans dischargeable. They theoretically are, but the burden of proof is so high that it's very hard to discharge a federal student loan. And there's actually been some good reporting lately about that. And I think you're going to talk a little bit about that. Student loans are with you for life. Your federal student loans, your private student loans, they're not going away. So I think bankruptcy reform is important, but I think that what we need is a larger cultural shift about, and we need to start retraining ourselves to talk about higher education as a public good. I find myself guilty of doing this. I've used these stats. You know, somebody who goes to college will earn $1 million more over their lifetime. Like it has gone away from the idea that all of us benefit when people can go to college and get the knowledge, the skills they need to live in a democracy and to compete in our workplace. So we need to really recapture the idea that our higher education system, particularly our public higher education system, which is where 3/4 of people go to get college credentials, is a public good, and we all have a stake in maintaining it and making sure it has support. I've become really interested in alternative ways of financing. We have to raise sort of the threshold, the minimum of state support, because it has declined so much. I think we need debt-free college. I think if you look, there is no other advanced nation that relies on student loans to help people pay for college. So I think we absolutely need debt-free college. There are many ways to get there. You could increase the purchasing power of the Pell Grant. We have to increase state funding. You could look at a pay-it-forward scheme that's kind of more like Australia and the UK, which is school's free on the front end. There's no tuition. There's no fees. You pay it back when you leave based on how many years you went, a percentage of your earnings. It's taken out of your paycheck. You don't get hounded by debt collectors. If you don't have a job, you don't have anything to pay. So I'm beginning to look more at a fundamental change in the way we finance higher education so that we completely get rid of the debt for diploma system. That's it.
That your spiel?
That's my spiel.
All right. So I want to talk about the people who are making most of the money off of all of our student loans. My name's Sarah. I'm a student debtor. I have 15 grand in student debt. I've had that 15 grand in student debt for about 10 years.
I have more.
I have not made a dent in it at all. I've paid nothing but interest for 10 years. And I have a job, and a pretty good job, and I have a master's degree, which theoretically makes me make more money, but, you know, doesn't actually when your master's degree is in journalism. So I pay that money every month to Sally Mae, who bought it from Citigroup, who I consolidated my loan with when I got out of school. Sally Mae bought that, let me see, a year and a half ago or something. I got a letter just telling me that now I was paying Sally Mae, which, if you think about it, was a little like, how do I know that they're telling me the truth and that I'm not paying the wrong person, which has happened to people. So what I want to talk about is there's multiple ways that the big banks, private lenders like Sally Mae are making money on student debt. It's not just originating loans, although that's the big one. So we'll start there. You didn't mention no, okay. In 2010, the Obama administration actually got rid of the federal family education loan, which was a massive, massive giveaway to the big banks and to the private lenders. Before that, the government was actually subsidizing those banks. This is what all my loans were 10 years ago, by paying interest to the bank while you were in school. We got rid of that. It's projected to save some $61 billion over the last 10 years, so you can think about how much money the government, us, taxpayers, were giving away to the big banks just with that. Now the government directly lends up to $31,000 a year. Anything more than that, which if you go to private universities, you pretty much are paying more than $31,000 a year just in tuition. Anything more than that, you have to take out private loans. 1 out of 5 borrowers now have private student loans, which was up from something like 3% in 1992. So that has skyrocketed in recent years. And those private loans are, like Tamara said, not dischargeable in bankruptcy, and yet they can charge you ridiculous interest. Most of them are variable rates, which means it'll raise and lower depending on the interest rates that the big banks are rigging in the first place. Wells Fargo's fixed rate private loan, 14% interest. There's another thing that's interesting that's going on with this right now, which is that JP Morgan, which was one of the biggest lenders, has now stopped issuing private loans to people who aren't already JP Morgan customers. So now finance bloggers and the like are speculating that the private student loan bubble is popping. Problem with the bubble popping is that you can't get rid of it. You can't get rid of your student debt, as Tamara said. So it's not going to pop the same way that the housing bubble popped, with housing prices plummeting and people walking away from their homes. It's going to be very different, and we don't know what that's going to look like. Where am I going to go? You already talked about the bankruptcy bill. So why do all these private lenders want to give you your student loans? Because they can sell them on the secondary market, the same way that they were selling your mortgage on the secondary market. The CFPB put out a lovely report that detailed some of these predatory lending practices. I recommend reading it. It's on their website. It's really depressing. They sell them as what they call slabs, student loan asset-backed securities, which are on private loans and these government-backed FFEL loans, which are guaranteed by the federal government. So this CFPB report found that because of the rush to securitize student loans, they were tending towards the same sort of predatory lending practices we saw in the mortgage bubble. So pushing people to sign private loans when they could have gotten federally backed loans at a lower rate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You guys know what the banks do, right? 2008, there was a bailout just of these FFEL loans that was probably more than $100 billion. The last number that I could find was $100 billion or so, because nobody was buying them on the secondary market anymore. So we bought them back from the banks that we had paid to originate them in the first place. Then, on top of this, these government direct loans, guess who's getting paid to service those loans? Once again, the same people. So there's I just did a big report on a company called NCO Group, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of JP Morgan Chase's private equity arm. NCO Group has in turn, a subsidiary of their own called University Accounting Services that has contracts to service, their website says 2.5 million loans. Stanford has a contract with them, University of New Orleans has a contract with them, lots of places. And that is, again, money that's going back up the ladder to JP Morgan. And lastly, my favorite part of this whole thing is that a lot of these banks and student lenders own, through private equity arms or other subsidiaries, own debt collection companies. So something like 1 in 7 Americans are being pursued by a debt collector for some reason right now. But my favorite part of all of this is that the Department of Education, which is already paying these people, and some were paying them to originate loans, is paying them to service loans, is also paying them millions of dollars to chase you down when you can't pay your loan. So the last contract for NCO Group was $68 million from the Department of Education. Now that you're all depressed, What I want to say in terms of we're talking about strategies for resistance is that these policies, a lot of them are really new. The bankruptcy code changed in 2005. This switch to direct loans was 2010. All of this has happened since I was out of college. The system that I was dealing with is gone. These are policies we can actually change. And even this summer when we saw the fight over the interest rate on the federal loans, and basically Mitt Romney and Obama were both out there saying, we're going to keep the interest rates low, we're going to keep the interest rates low. They know that they have to do something. They know that both parties need to win over young voters. We need to be pushing on this right now because I think we can actually make a change. And that's Andrew.
Thank you, Sarah.
I think I'm a little more skeptical about those policies. I'm going to make some comments about debt resistance, and so I've been much of the last year involved as a debt resistor activist. And one of the problems with being a single issue activist is that you see your issue everywhere. You wake up in the morning, debt is under your bed, and you open the fridge and you turn on the TV and you see debt. And you see it on the billboards, you see debt everywhere. There's an occupational hazard of being a single issue activist. But the striking thing is debt is everywhere. The debt economy is in every single corner of our lives. And the more that our basic needs are debt financed, the more our friends, the 1%, are taking a huge cut as they expand their orbit of profit taking. The other thing about being a single issue activist, usually it's difficult to make coalitions, but in the case of debt, I find it's pretty easy actually. The work that we did in the Occupy Student Debt Campaign from November for several months fed into a coalition at the beginning of this summer, a coalition of Occupy groups, which is called Strike Debt. And Strike Debt is targeting all kinds of debt: housing debt, medical debt, education debt, credit card debt, municipal debt, sovereign debt, climate debt, and financial fringe debt. And I can talk more about the work of Strike Debt in Q&A if you want. If a debt resistors movement does come into being, then it's clear that a key trigger will have been the student debt crisis. Even before the recession hit, when employment prospects for students were still quite plausible, and when education debt was still seen as a good consumer asset, it was pretty clear that mounting levels of student debt were posing an obstacle to the smooth passage of students into the top quintile of American economic life, which is where most students want to be. Now we find wealth increasingly diverted to the 1%, is bypassing the top quintile. The jobs economy is in tatters, and that belief that student loans are a sound investment in a high-income future are very fast eroding. There are more and more people that are talking about student debt as a form of indenture. After all, our economic elites and political elites keep telling us that you need a college degree as a passport to a decent livelihood. And the upshot of that is that you have to go into debt in order to labor. And going into debt in order to labor is the essence of indenture. Now, some people find the analogy offensive. If you don't like that analogy, think of student loans, student debt as a form of wage theft. It's a theft of your future wages, the theft on the part of the finance industry. Or think of it as an illegitimate tax, which is extracted from your future wages, again, by the lending industry. Now, one thing's for sure, the public dismay about the student debt crisis has reached critical mass. Whether it was a public amplifier of Occupy or student resistance movements in Chile or Quebec or Europe, there's no one now who isn't concerned about it. The one thing we can be sure of, however, and this I think is where I depart a little from Sarah and Tamara, is that we can't expect anything in the way of debt relief from the government. Legislators are offering nothing more than cosmetic reforms and are not in a position to offer anything else. If debt relief is going to come, then it's going to come from debtors. They're going to take it for themselves by any means necessary. which is why we need a debt resistors movement on a mass scale to bring the invisible army of defaulters out of the shadows. Now, the other thing that's become quite clear is that for workforce entrants, especially the college educated, increasingly what we're seeing is that they have to go into debt in order just to meet the basic requirements for employability. If you're lucky enough to find a job that pays any kind of living wage, then an increasingly large share of that wage goes to service the debts that were incurred simply to meet the physical and mental requirements of employability. Think about that. And the list of costs and fees, and we're not just talking about tuition fees here, the list of costs and fees is ever increasing. Think about what it requires for you to be in good health. Ever more costly nutrition, because if you eat a basic American processed food diet, you will get sick. You also need preventive medicine to reduce stress. You also need gym membership fees, which for youth these days are absolutely mandatory. When I was a youth, you were considered a freak if you went to the gym, even gay men. Nowadays, it's completely mandatory. There are all these costs that go into sustaining the right kind of mind-body balance for the well-tempered worker in the knowledge economy, and they're costs that you bear. None of them come under a typical health insurance policy, even if you're lucky to have one. Add on the cost of upskilling. Our elites tell us increasingly that a bachelor's degree is no longer good enough. You need a master's degree as a passport to the knowledge economy, and we know how expensive those are. These are some of the biggest magnifiers of student debt. Plus, last but not least, you have to sustain yourself through a series of unpaid internships. Now, all of these costs and fees, increasingly I find my students thinking of them as a kind of hedge, and I use the financial term advisedly, as a hedge against falling below the threshold of employability in the decades to come. Now that's a very calculating outlook, and I don't blame my students for thinking of college education that way, although I don't, obviously, and many of you I'm sure don't. But the calculating outlook is very much the mentality of a financialized society, right? It's a society that has exhausted its capacity for profit-taking in the present and is circulating ever more paper claims on the future. Now, any act of borrowing is a way of renouncing the future, but the kinds of rates of interest we're talking about, as Sarah mentioned, take a huge chunk of the future away from you. And we're not just talking about an individual tipping point here, we're also talking about societal tipping point, which is the point at which the cost of servicing debts nationally far surpasses the value of the debt. We've reached a point in this society of negative equity. And that's the point at which a society like the US can no longer deliver on its promise as a democracy of delivering an incrementally improved future for its citizenry. That's particularly egregious in the case of societies like the US, for whom the creation of a stable middle class with rising expectations was the pinnacle achievement of its 20th century. So we're talking here also about a state-level crisis. The levels of indebtedness in countries like this are completely unsustainable. There's no large-scale fix available. The debts will never be paid off. And the only question is how debt forgiveness is going to be administered in the years to come. How is that going to happen? This is a question that's on the table of elites right now. There is a precedent, I think, for this. And here we're talking about the perspective of elites, right, not debtors. And the precedent is the early 20th century, when Henry Ford and other industrialists decided that they had to give workers more wages. They had to hike up workers' wages in order to turn them into consumers, to jumpstart consumer society, give them purchasing power. Now, in retrospect, we think, well, that was a no-brainer. Of course you had to do that. But at the time, it went completely against the grain of capitalist habit. Raising wages for workers? Not on. I think we reached a similar moment with regard to debt. that the nation's economic managers are going to have to entertain debt reductions of a considerable scale in order to facilitate the re-entry of the middle class into big-ticket consumer life. Otherwise, no one will be able to afford a house, a car, children, whatever. And the challenge for those elites is how they're going to pull that off without damaging the utility of payback morality, which is very useful to creditors, right? What do I mean by payback morality? I mean the ideology of loan repayment, the ideology that loan repayment is a moral test of our individual personalities, and that if we do not do this, something very bad will happen. It's not only immoral, but we will go to hell, and society will as well. This is the glue that holds the whole debt economy together. So our job, as I see it, I'm going to conclude, our job, as I see it, is we need to figure out ways of taking apart that moralism. We need to figure out ways of shaking off the shame and the guilt that is attached to debt. And so far, at least in the campaigns that I've been involved in, we figured out a few ways of working at that, and I'll just name 3 of them. The first one is coming out about debt in public. The ritual of speaking openly and publicly about your debt. It was something we adopted in our strike debt assemblies during the summer that we did in New York City parks, that people spoke openly and very emotionally about their debts, and as a way of dissipating the shame and the guilt. The second one is circulating more of a public understanding of how debt is created, and because it involves the creation of money. Money is created as interest-bearing debt. It is brought into existence. It is lent into existence. The public image is still largely one of, the banker goes to the vault and picks up a little bag of money and brings it in and hands it over to you. That's not how it works. Right? The money is created at the moment that you sign a loan agreement. It does not exist hitherto. It's not the banker's money. Bankers need borrowers to bring money into existence, to perform this magical act from which they profit. And once people understand that, this is a vital part of public education, then it changes the psychology of the debtor in very significant ways, and in ways we still haven't begun to imagine. The last point is, the last strategy is exposing the double standard which exists at the very center of the debt economy. Lenders, creditors, bankers, they do not expect to ever pay off their debts. They know that their debts will get written off, renegotiated, recapitalized, whatever, bailed out. They will not have to pay off their debts. They know that. It's only the little people that are expected to pay off their debts. We've seen this in the last several years since the financial crash. This has been open to public scrutiny, and more people are realizing that this is the double standard. So these are just 3 small things, but they're ways, and there are others, but they're ways of helping to mutate the psychology of debt, to break up the moralism around debt. And once that happens in a very significant way, once people are in the position of knowing that denying their creditors is not only not immoral, but is a way of seeking relief for themselves through self-organization, then I think we'll have the makings of a mass debt resistance movement.
Thank you, Andrew. So we can start by you guys having a little discussion. I know you were taking some notes during the presentations, or I can ask a question. If you have something to interject right away, any of you guys, welcome to start.
I just think we both got really excited when he said debt as wage, student debt as wage theft. Because I'm a labor reporter, so
You guys are in the back, by the way.
Yeah.
Make sure.
Am I loud enough? I can
Okay,
be louder.
great.
The frame of wage theft is one that I find really compelling and really helpful in order to talk about all sorts of labor issues. But I had never thought about student debt that way, and I think that's really interesting and pretty compelling.
Well, go ahead.
Well, it's I'm glad you do, Sarah. It's the problem is it's the wages of the future,
Right.
but that's what debt is.
Yeah.
And I think just as in an industrial era, wage conflict was a frontline struggle.
Right.
Conflict over debt is going to be our frontline struggle. I mean, not because wage conflict is over, it never will be, but because debt is the wages of the future, quite literally. Yeah. And that's how the 1% profits from it.
I actually was more excited by the idea of going into debt in order to labor, which is also, I think, a really disturbing way of thinking about what student loan debt really is, because we've been sold the idea that it's an investment in your future. But if you think about it as we are requiring people to go into debt in order to be able to work, I think most people would find that a little morally disgusting. So thank you.
Yeah,
I love new ways of talking and thinking about this.
I've sort of made this connection when talking about the DREAM Act, which, if anybody is not familiar, would allow undocumented young people to gain citizenship if they either go to college or join the military. And the military part is obviously problematic, right? But when you think about the fact that undocumented students don't get in-state tuition in most states, they have to pay the higher rate. They're not eligible for the federal student loans the same way. You're essentially saying not only can you can get your citizenship if you go to college, but essentially you can get your citizenship if you sign up for a heck of a lot of debt. And so, yeah, when we think about it that way, it's compelling. But if you even bring that back to people like us who don't have to worry about getting citizenship in order to labor, we still have to worry about getting that degree.
So maybe I can ask a little bit about the kind of feeling of gratitude that people are supposed to have about the debt they're taking on, which Andrew's talking about some different ways of trying to overcome that or counter that. But the American higher education system is rather unique in its mix of having a lot of private, nonprofit universities, and in the last couple decades especially, private for-profit universities. So this makes, it seems like that might influence the way that we think about the politics of student debt in some ways. Because especially if you are someone who went to a private four-year university, which I did, I thought I had complete grants to pay for all of my loans. What I didn't know was that the university's kind of financial calculations meant that, in fact, I was going to have to take out additional loans on top. So I ended up with $25,000 in debt, not really knowing that going in. Yeah. But someone could say, you decided that you wanted to go to a better school, maybe, or you decided that you were going to play this game, to kind of hedge against the future, as Andrew put it. So how do you deal with that when you're trying to talk about student debt politics?
I mean, people are very shaming about this stuff, right? I just looked at Twitter while Andrew was talking, and there are people tweeting at me that I should just pay my bills. And I'm like, I've paid my bills every month for 10 years.
On this panel?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
People are watching this panel.
People are watching it. Sarah's tweeting it.
Wow.
It's all your fault. But this is a thing, right?
I should thank Abdul Hakim, who is doing the videography tonight. Thank you so much for all of the help.
These are people from the lending industry, and you should be ashamed of yourself.
Right. Well, also,
How do you sleep at night?
A friend of mine who is a U.S. citizen but is also a Russian citizen, and she's living in Moscow working on an English language paper in Russia, and she had a baby last year. And she got to a point where she could either pay for the hospital visits while she was pregnant or pay her student loan. And she wrote this very compelling piece that we actually reposted at Alternate, and it blew up the site and was the #1 most read story about her decision to stop paying her loans. And she got death threats. I mean, this is a very, very real moral culture that we're talking about here. People get very, very angry and shaming, and it was her fault because she went to Duke and she should have gone somewhere else, and what did she think she was getting herself into? But at the same time, when you are looking for a job or when you are looking to go to school, the guidance counselor at your high school doesn't say, well, if you go to Duke, you're going to be paying, $40,000 a year or whatever it is now. And if you go to the University of North Carolina, and you're a North Carolina resident anyway, you can pay a lot less. They don't say that. They push you to go to the best school because it's in their interests for their high school to look better if you go to the fancy school. I remember a few years ago giving a lecture to a friend's younger brother who was looking at schools, and I was like, you were a straight A student and you're the captain of the wrestling team, somebody will pay you to go to school. Do not go into debt. But, there's this massive amount of shame that people will throw at you, and it's very, very hard to get past that other than just continuing to not care and just to keep talking about it.
I think the judgments between going into debt to go to a private university versus a state university are really, really difficult. I tend to focus on public universities because the majority of people go to public universities. I went to a state school for my undergraduate degree. I think as a threshold, we have to argue for free access, debt-free access to the public system, because what happens in the public system also impacts the private system. And the reality is the cost of going to a private school today, or the cost of going to a state school today is the same burden it cost to go to a private school a generation ago after you adjust for inflation. So the private university market is a kind of a different thing. I mean, the inequality has been a huge driver in what has happened to private tuition. You have a very wealthy class that can pay out of pocket full tuition, room and board, and all of the schools are dying to get those people to come to their school, and it's a race to luxury that they are engaged in. And I've talked to a president president of a small liberal arts school, and nobody's going to unilaterally disarm, because if they do, they lose. And at the same time, they can't collude with each other to say, we're not going to build any more luxury dorms or sushi bars or whatever nonsense the private universities are doing.
Or expand into the West Village.
Because they're not allowed, or take over Lower Manhattan, because they're not allowed to actually collude with each other to do that. So I guess I would say my personal opinion is we have to spend a lot of time rebuilding support for state higher education, because it, as Andrew said, it is what built the middle class, one of many investments that built the middle class, but it is probably the biggest investment this country has made that has paid off. The magnitude of, the return on investment that we've gotten as a nation is probably incalculable. So, I'm a working class kid. I care about the state university system, and honestly, I don't lose sleep at night about the cost of little small liberal arts schools.
Well,
sorry.
I'm glad.
Many of you probably went to those schools, but that's where my heart is.
There's also an interesting point there, which is that, if you go to, so where did I see this? That if you went to Harvard or Yale, you are more likely to get out with less debt because they will pay for lower income people than at this point if you go to a state school. If you went to the University of California, I believe was a stat.
Yeah.
So that's the interesting thing.
Which is really also
is
really depressing.
It really is, though, the mid-level liberal arts schools, which is where I went, that you really get screwed. Because, most kids at Yale aren't getting out with debt. They're either paying out of pocket or they're being paid for. Most kids at Loyola New Orleans, where I went, were taking on debt to go there.
Yeah.
And this is where the first time that I'm going to troll Mike Consul from the stage, because I know he's back there somewhere. Mike wrote a wonderful post because I baited him with an email at 7 a.m. once saying, hey, I was just doing my taxes and the government lets me write off all the interest that I paid on my student loans this year. And Mike, because he crunches numbers, went through all of the ways that the government subsidizes this debt and figured out that we could essentially make public higher ed free for what we're already paying. And then that would be, at least in some way, a downward market pressure on the private universities, right? If you could get a really good free education at CUNY, at wherever, and it's comparable to what you're getting, and in some programs better even now, than what you're paying in some other places. I would tell you to go to CUNY for graduate school for journalism before Columbia. So that would be a massive issue. If you could actually do free, when you're saying $18,000 a year versus $40,000 a year, it's a little easier to say,
Right.
well, I'm going to go to the school that has the name. But if it's free versus $40,000 a year, you're going to be losing students.
And I think you're right that it wouldn't be $40,000 a year.
Right.
Can I just say a little word about the for-profit sector? Because
Yes,
please.
I'm glad that Tamara mentioned the creation of the middle class in this country, which is largely on the back of the GI Bill. Some of you may not know there's a new GI Bill that was introduced after 9/11, essentially, and after the wars of foreign adventurism, and it's mostly for the veterans coming back, and by far the majority of the funds from the new GI Bill have flowed into the for-profit universities. And if there's one thing the for-profit universities are not doing, it is rebuilding the middle class, or creating anything like a new middle class. And while I agree with Sarah that the worst examples of individual student debt come from student debtors from middle-income backgrounds who go to a fairly elite private college, and these are the poster children that the media producers love to feast on.
Yep.
Inviting a kind of audience response of how could they do that? How could they rack up that kind of debt? As a way of blaming the victim, of course. By far the worst impacts, proportionately, of the student debt economy fall in low-income populations. And you have to look at the for-profit universities to see all the evidence of this. The more and more families, especially first-generation college families, who lack information or access to information about the choices available to them in the higher education landscape, they're more and more being pushed into the for-profit sector, especially now that public universities are too expensive. And they're told that the for-profit sector is a better deal. And the for-profit universities are the worst kind of predatory trap. Very low percentage of folks who graduate, very high percentage of debt, and an alarming degree of collusion between the financial aid counselors of these institutions and the lending industry. Plus, they have a very powerful lobby on Capitol Hill, and very well-known politicians, when they retire from politics, go to work for that lobby. People like Dick Gephardt, one of the liberal lines of the Senate. To my mind, if you're looking for a vulnerable target to focus on, it would be the for-profit sector. But it's a very powerful lobby, and the lending industry is very, very aggressive in defending its rights and privileges. And the flip side of what Sarah mentioned with respect to the guilt and the shame is the belligerence with which the lending industry will attack you if you put your head up above the trenches. You will get shot at. I mean, we discovered this in the Occupy Student Debt campaign. A stream of vitriol emanates from the lending industry. Anyone who says anything about that student debt resistance on the internet landscape is attacked, or in public generally, is attacked quite vociferously. And they employ trolls, they employ internet trolls, they employ people who are even worse than trolls, people who really, I don't know how they sleep at night, but they are very vigorous in defending their rights and privileges, and it is a war if you decide to join the resistance.
Can I make one point about the for-profit? Because there are, I will say it so I don't get total hate mail, there are maybe a handful of good actors in this sector, but by and large, the sector is really a scourge on the higher education community. The thing about the for-profit sector is two things. One, by and large, they are owned by Wall Street, private equity. They're publicly traded on the stock market, so you have that incentive. And they are propped up through the federal student loan system. So while they're private, they are actually quite public because the lion's share of their revenue comes through the student loan debt system and the Pell Grant system.
Yeah, I would highly recommend checking out Mike Consul's article, which is in this latest issue of Dissent. He co-wrote with Aaron Beatty. The article is about public higher education, but in the end it's also about for-profit education because the argument is that as investment goes down in public higher ed, you're going to have a door opened basically for the for-profits. There is some, what was the news this week with the for-profits? Can someone who is reporting on this fill in? I thought there was a new report out, maybe.
I think the CFPB might have. No, that wasn't on student. Yeah, that was on something else.
Never mind.
I didn't see it.
I have more questions, but maybe we can open it up for audience questions right now, and then if we don't have many, I can ask some more. So, does anyone have a question? Yes, please.
The amount of money you say is the debt overhang, $1 trillion incurred debt. Is that just loans that are incurred by students, or is that the parental side of the loan picture as well? And if it is, I have a follow-up.
Does anyone know that?
That's a good question.
I think it's an aggregate.
I think it's
It's
both.
the aggregate, yeah.
I think it's both. Yeah.
With the students, you have the debt and the inability to find a job after incurring the debt, and then you're indentured. On the baby boomer side, you had the old system, which they said they thought were buying into. That's me.
Yeah.
Incurred debt is a parental loan.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Paid off from my job, and now I'm facing
Right.
debt that I can't pay back.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. There's no job out there for me.
Yeah.
I have a debt that I've incurred for my
Right.
children.
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
wondering, if I stick my head above the trenches,
Yeah.
what is actually going to happen if I say I'm just going to pay this back?
Yeah, and certainly that's true for the private loans. So, $1 trillion, about $860 billion is federal student loans, and then about 160 is private student loans.
That's the plus loans as well as the other
In the federal student figure, yes. And then there's a lot of co-signing that happens in the private student loan market. So there's probably a lot of parents in that 160 billion as well.
Yeah, it's why our friend Stephen Lerner likes to call it family debt and
Right.
not student debt, because it affects the whole thing. There's one other thing, which is that a lot of those secondary mortgages that were a big problem and continue to be a big problem in the housing market were taken out to send kids to college. And so there's a lot of student debt that isn't even classed on the books as student debt, but probably is in fact student debt.
For sure.
Can I just try and answer your question about what would happen if you put your head above?
Don't scare them all away, Andrew.
No, that's what we're trying to.
We're recruiting,
right?
We're trying to accommodate through strike debt. This is the first product of strike debt, the Resistors Operation Manual, which gives debtors a lot of advice. Some of it called from industry insiders about how to escape debt, all kinds of debt. But it also is written to persuade the reader that collective action is the only effective way of changing the debt economy. Our second project is something called the Rolling Jubilee, which will be launched in mid-November. And basically, what we're doing is raising a little money to buy up some debt on the secondary market and abolish it. Because you can buy debt very, very cheaply on the secondary market for pennies on the dollar. And once we abolish it, we'll find out who the debtors are. We'll write to them and tell them it's been eliminated, and they're under no obligation to do anything about it. But if they want to kick in a little money to the fund, it's a rolling fund, and it will help us to buy out other people's debt. And so our aspiration is that this is a small demonstration model. It's a limited amount of debt. It's going to be medical debt to begin with. but that it will scale up and have some momentum. The third and larger aspiration really is to create a network, something more like a debtors union, a network of affiliated groups and chapters around the country and internationally. We already have a lot of international allies, especially in Europe, that we're working with. And once we have a critical mass of members in the membership structure, then we're in a position really to strike debt. I mean, to launch debt strikes and weaken financial institutions, and at the same time help to build and create an alternative economy that is not a for-profit economy, that uses money for social credit in socially productive ways, which is a long-term goal. So if you stick your head above the trenches, you can come and join us and be part of this. Otherwise, you'll be defaulting as an individual in an atomized fashion and facing the consequences, which are not pleasant currently.
In the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of really militant direct actions in South America.
Speak up, Mike. Stand up and speak up, Mike.
In the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of really militant direct actions in South America and Quebec and the UK about the corporatization or the dismantling of public education, however you want to refer to it. And I know Sarah's covered it. Why don't you think we see that here, and how can we use those international experiences to help broaden the movement in the United States?
Do you want me to start? When I was in Quebec, the thing I came back from there saying was like, our system is here, and we want to get here, and their system was here, and they wanted to get here. It was such a different fight. In Quebec, at least, all of the universities are public. They all cost the same. So whether you're going to McGill or you're going to anything else, if you are a Quebec resident, they all cost the same. It's very easy to have solidarity across that whole system. It's very hard to get, I mean, even in New York, we've got everything from CUNY to community colleges to NYU to Columbia. It's very, very hard to build solidarity across a system like that, that is, people's concerns are massively different. The enemies are massively different. There, they had to get the government to, what they actually ended up pretty much succeeding in doing was changing the government. But they had to get the government to agree. Here, you'd have to get the government and however many different university boards of trustees that are all horrible corporate shills. CUNY too. I read your board of trustees recently. It was no fun. And so their target was smaller, easier. It was a lot easier to build that culture, and they were asking for something small. The tuition hikes were very little compared to what most tuition hikes in the U.S. are every year, which is something like, I don't even know the percentages off the top of my head. I don't know as much about the Latin American countries that have been seeing this resistance.
So the only thing I would add is another issue I also work on is paid family leave and childcare. And I think in many ways that is illustrative of a larger sort of way that Americans think about social policy and what the government should or shouldn't provide. So the United States, every time I say this, people, well-educated people, and hopefully some of you in this room will be shocked by this, but the United States is the only country in the world besides Swaziland and Papua New Guinea that does not guarantee paid family leave. The only country in the world that does not provide paid family leave. So a lot of what other young people take for granted in other countries is something we still don't have here in the United States. And I think the same is true in terms of things that are considered more public goods and social responsibilities in other democracies especially. It has been almost since my entire lifetime that I have heard that you are on your own. Whether you succeed or not is because of you and the choices you made. There is a very strong, especially now, and I think we're actually at a turning point. I think this election 50 to 100 years from now, this era, this time period, will be probably judged as the end of sort of the height of a very individualistic personal responsibility, the market as sort of the arbiter of opportunity and all that is good in the nation is going to end. What comes in its place, I think, is up for grabs. But I don't discount sort of the very extreme era of individualism we have been in. And I don't think most students think they have a right to a free public higher education system in this country. Because one, a lot of people don't know that we actually used to have something that was radically different from what we have today. And it doesn't help that all the elites, many of whom I do way too many panels with, continue to talk about this is an investment in your future and you're going to earn so much more than if you didn't go to college. One thing we haven't talked about, and I don't want to hog the time, but earnings for college grads have been flat for a generation, except for women. But women started at a much lower place. So you all will make more than your moms did, the typical earnings of a college grad. You'll make more than your moms did. I mean, I would hope so. You have a lot more career opportunities. Women work more, and you're better educated. Men make about what their dads did. If you have a college degree, your typical earnings are about what your dads were when he was between 25 and 34 years old back in 1980. But you have 5 figures of student loan debt that you have to pay for, not to mention that housing costs more today, healthcare costs more today, basically all basic necessities cost more today than they did a generation ago. So the idea, the reason why you're going to make $1 million more is because everybody else is making so much less, not because college degree earners are running away. Some of them are. I mean, we have rampant inequality, but the average, the median, has been flatlined for a generation.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of things. Why student movements are different here or different in other countries. One, I think, is there's a direct relationship with the state. The students in other countries who are very much apprentice elites, that they have this conversation with the state, and it's taken very personally, and it's taken in a very class. It's an intra-class conversation, and so they feel they have a lot of standing when they stand up to the state. It's not the case in this country, largely because, well, higher education is not a ward of the state. I mean, to some degree it was once in certain places, as Tamara reminded us, and if you think about the Berkeley free speech movement, that was a dialogue with the state of California. It was a dialogue with the elites that run the state of California, and it was over the conditions and terms of the master plan for higher education in which we've written about in California.
It's a great piece on that in this sentence.
Yeah, exactly. That no longer exists because there isn't because higher education is not a ward of the state, and in fact, the federal government has been a leader in privatizing education by introducing this debt financing, this individual debt financing through student loans. The last thing I would add is that student debt is one of the reasons why students in general have less time available to be politically active. A lot of the so-called political apathy of student generations in the last couple of decades or so has a lot to do with the lack of available time. They're trying desperately to stay out of debt. My students fall asleep in their classrooms, not because they're partying, some of them are, but not only because they're partying, because they're doing 2 or 3 jobs to stave off going further into debt. So the burdening of students with debt has been a way of stifling their optional political imagination, and I don't think that's conspiratorial to say that. And I think if you really did a evidence-based study, you would find a lot of material to support that.
As a quick follow-up before we get the audience question, you don't have to pay back student debts in this country for a year, 6
6
months
months.
after
6
6 months after graduation, you can defer it past that. So when you're talking about trying to build this movement, are you trying to also talk to students who don't have the debt yet? Because do they feel the pain yet, or are they really anxious about it in a way that they weren't before? Or
our experience is that currently enrolled students don't perceive their debt as indebtedness.
Yep.
That it's funny money, and it's not until they have to pay it off or start paying it off that they actually perceive it existentially as debt. This is not just student debtors; it's debtors in general. Yeah. Until they fall behind in their debt payments, debtors don't think of themselves as being in debt. They do when they can't make the payments, but when they're making routine monthly payments, yep, that's not being in debt. That's so normalized. It's just making your monthly payments. Yep. Your bank does it, for most debtors these days. So it's even more remote.
Yeah. In a weird way, the 6-month grace period serves as a time. It's depoliticizing, right? If you were actually thinking in your last couple of months at school, oh no, I got to get a job right now because I got to pay the student loans off, and you're still on campus with a lot of other people who are having that collective experience, it would be a lot easier to be organizing people. Because people aren't having that experience together, they're having it off on their own somewhere. It's very different, and it's very, very hard. I've done a lot of these panels at colleges and universities, and kids have a very hard time conceptualizing what they're going to be stuck with. And I was actually, Tamara mentioned being on panels with elites. I was on one with the student loan officer of the school, who said to the students, in all good humor, oh, well, you guys are all going to get out and make $70,000, $80,000 a year when you graduate, so don't worry, you'll be able to pay off like more than your monthly minimum. And I started laughing because I have never made $70,000 a year in my life, and I'm 32 with a master's degree. You know what I mean? And I'm just going, who are you, what jobs are you letting these kids out into that are going to be making $70,000, $80,000 a year when they first graduate? That's not going to happen. Maybe 2 of them will.
Unless they go and work in the finance industry.
Yeah, well, that was the Yale panel. That was different.
A question in the back wall.
Hi, I am a undergraduate student here at the Draut Center. Thank you for this panel. It's really, really lovely and great to see you for being here. So I'm a graduate student, and because I'm a graduate student at CUNY, I also teach at City College. So I have 2 parts here. I'd like to make an announcement. The first thing is that some folks from New York Students Rising, which is a student group out of SUNY, State University of New York, are trying to gather folks at a meeting called Envisioning Student Unionism tomorrow from 2 to 5 p.m. at 224 West 9th Street. So that's happening. But my question is, as this specific kind of extra student grad student, because I feel like I am both student and professor, and there's lots of energy right now in New York in terms of student organizing, but I'm wondering, especially coming off of this last question, to what degree are professors responsible for kind of like talking about this debt problem, and how do we address the anxiety that these professors are obviously going to have that you can't talk that this debt isn't worth it because then you're suggesting that the education isn't worth it, and then are you attacking my salary, which is something that like as young professors we're also going to have to be fighting for at the same time in some cases.
What?
Professor?
It's a good question. There's a wall of denial among faculty. I could say that I've certainly experienced it about addressing this issue. It's beginning to erode very slightly, but brick by brick, it's being dismantled. But it's a very high wall. And it's explicable on a number of fronts. One is that when people talk about the rise in college costs, they sometimes they have in mind faculty salaries, which is a bit of a joke given how the instructional costs of the academic workforce have been sliced almost in half because of casualization over the course of the last 20 years or so. And also the average, even full-time tenure track salary has stagnated. So there's a certain amount of denial about this and protectiveness. In addition, faculty are a besieged academics are pretty besieged. They suffer. They have this burden of this siege mentality, and they feel they're attacked on all sides. I think it's very debilitating. They should be more outspoken in general, and speaking out, as I said earlier, in the case of debtors, is a way of expunging a lot of that shame and guilt. And I think we should function in the same way for full-time faculty, especially who have security. But I wouldn't hold my breath. It's going to take a while for the most secure sector of the professoriate to join forces with everyone else. And I would focus on everyone else for the time being, because that's where the action is going to happen, and as it always has done.
My question is related to this future of jobs in this country. A couple of you said, like, the future should be, the elites should at some point realize that they need to have a middle class that can spend, etc. But I'm comparing that to sort of the global scene where there are 200 million, at least, spenders in India who are characterized as middle class, or in China, and in Brazil too. And I'm just really wondering, is it really realistic to consider that the elites really need us to be the consumers? They've already, in the same vein that they've changed the laws to make sure that we can't go bankrupt in 2005, they've also been really active in gutting any laws that protect natural resources in this country. And I do know that in Australia in the last 15, 20 years, a lot of college graduates found themselves driving trucks or lorries in mining towns because there's no work for university educated people. And our corporations have more cash in their pockets now, but they are not releasing it into the workplace to create work. And it seems like, well, it could be a conspiracy, I don't know, but it's aligned shared values and shared objectives to reduce, to do something that they're not spending their money. And I'm just wondering if any of you in your work, in your research, in your future forecasting and ideas have thought of this. I mean, how are we really going to survive this if it's not going to be 70 and it's not going to be 30, but in real dollars it's going to be much less? Currency debases, which does happen historically in these kinds of debt money systems that were invented by the Medici, and it's been used for hundreds of years against population.
Can we answer? So I was going to say, it wasn't just that the elites decided to give us nice jobs. We had a really, really militant labor movement that took nice jobs. Henry Ford wanted to make sure that his workforce didn't unionize. That's why he gave them raises. We didn't just get things handed to us by the people from above. We fought like hell and people died for it. This is where I give my labor reporter impassioned speech.
You get
but
on it.
We fought for this. We have to fight for it again. We are fighting for it again. People are doing that all over the place. And what drives me insane is when people like the teachers in Chicago or the workers at Walmart go on strike and everybody goes, oh, well, it doesn't matter to me. Or even better, says, well, those lazy teachers need to get back to work and they're making too much money. The only reason we had a middle class, which happened well before massive free public education or accessible public education, was because we had a labor movement. We need something equivalent to that now, or we're never going to have good jobs, because no, Jamie Dimon is not just going to hand over the cash.
And neither is the shareholders of Walmart.
Exactly.
I do agree with you, however, when it comes to university elites. They probably don't need us, precisely because of the rising middle class in other countries. And we're already seeing evidence of this. Even if the domestic demand fell off, if students in the States of the U.S. decided it's not worth it anymore, we're not going to enroll, they would fill those places, and they already are doing that with overseas students and raking in higher fees. It's beginning to happen at the big public universities. The University of California no longer is mandated to service, the 10% of the high school population. That social contract has been called off, and the universities that are more entrepreneurial, like my employer, are setting up shop all over the world. so that overseas students don't have to come to them. They still do here on Washington Square, but they're expanding their revenue stream by going to meet them. And the estimated increase in the global higher education market over the next decade is 80%, which is the kind of number that has investors salivating, and certainly has university administrators figuring out how they can line their pockets even more by expanding offshore. So I think those elites, I mean, the other elites are another question. That's a much bigger debate, I think. But those elites probably fundamentally and ultimately maybe don't need us.
I think I have time for one more question if anyone has one before we go. I think in the back had your hand up for a while.
I used to be a congressional staff in upstate New York. That was for a Democrat.
They're all
The
evil.
interesting thing is that when we look at political campaigns nowadays, we look at the concept from the progressive side that says, oh, we need affordable education. But the mentality is that even Republicans who went to public universities try to deny that benefit for future generations. Now, I just want to know what kind of, what causes that sort of mental disconnection for the more conservative side of this country? Because it seems like for the $700 billion in which tax cuts that we give away each year, that could fund public education yearly for everyone.
I'm trying not to give a flip remark. I think a couple things happen. I think generations tend to rewrite their own history, and a lot of people think that they worked their way through college. Why can't you? Because it used to be true that you could actually work, and I'm not talking full-time, but work like a full-time job, minimum wage over the summer, and then maybe work 15 hours during the school year and actually work your way through college, pay for college. People tend to grossly discount inflation. So if your mom or dad ever said, well, when I had my first job in 1970, I got paid $6,000 or whatever. But they don't adjust for inflation, and oftentimes that means their starting salary was much higher than yours will ever be. So I think there's a lot of just cognitive dissonance that's related to math and not understanding math. And then I think there's a story, a fable we tell ourselves, and particularly conservatives, that your success is because you're awesome and moral and walked the straight and narrow and have a great ethic and stayed the course. Discounting the luck of birth, one. Two, any public support that enabled you to do what you did to get where you are. So I think there's a lot of things that lead to that that happening. I'll just leave it there. This is taped.
Well, yeah, I watched some congressional testimony not that long ago. Virginia Fox, who is the ranking the Republican in charge of the Education Committee, higher education. Virginia Fox is, I don't know how old she is exactly, but at least in her 60s, maybe older. And she was up there lecturing people about how she worked her way through college, and so should everybody else be able to. Well, here, I don't know where Virginia Fox went to college. I know where my dad went. He went to Columbia up here. If they didn't accept me, I'm mad. When he graduated in 1968. Columbia was about $1,800 a year.
Is that adjusted for inflation?
Anybody know what it is now?
Well, it's like 35,000, 40,000.
More than that, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know if we had
so even
Columbia students
adjusted
in here
for
who could actually
inflation,
tell me.
it would be
right,
like 6,000 or something.
It's ridiculous. It's totally different. There's no comparison at all to what our parents' generation was paying to what we're paying. It's just crazy to compare.
Not to mention the minimum wage has lost its purchasing power since our parents were in school. So,
exactly.
Minimum wage was like worth $10 an hour back in 1968. Yeah. So a lot of it is just that,
Tuition is taxed now. We work for the university, you get paid tuition remission.
Yeah.
When I went there, I worked on radio school, and I had to pay tax on tuition.
Yeah. Yep. I paid taxes on tuition remission when I was in grad school.
One comment on the math. You mentioned $700 billion. Our estimate was that it would cost $70 billion for the federal government to pay the tuition of every 2- and 4-year-old college student in this country, which is a really tiny slice of the federal budget. And if you want to put it in perspective, we found an audit of the Pentagon that discovered that the Pentagon wastes $70 billion each year in unaccountable spending. So what the Pentagon wastes and no one can account for would provide a free public education in colleges and universities in this country like that.
Yeah. Or that $100 billion that we spent bailing out the private student loans on the secondary market. We could have bailed out all the student borrowers instead.
There we go.
Luckily, the disposition matrix will make the federal security apparatus much more streamlined and efficient. So,
we got a disposition matrix for them. Anyway.
That's all the time we have for questions, but we do have the room for another half hour. We're going to have a little reception. I want to thank, first of all, the CUNY Grad Center General Assembly for giving us this room tonight. Thank you guys so much. I also want to thank DSA and YDS, the partner organization, for all of their help with tonight. And I want to thank our panelists, Tamara, Draut, Sarah Jaffe, Andrew Ross. Thank you all so much.
Union speech.
That's great.
And thank you
we're doing
to
that. We have this
section
great
from the
report
Danish Social
coming out.
Democratic Youth.
It's a good show.
Appreciate
Should take it on the road.
Yeah, this is great.
Call me Norma Ray. The only union job I ever had was when I was a graduate teaching assistant.
Oh,
Yeah.
Where?
That's Temple.
Temple?
Yeah.